I thought about giving an opportunity to everyone to join in pronouncing those names with me this morning, but I was afraid of a revolt, so I did not.
We were thankful that was you.
Some of those are pretty challenging. Okay, so what do we have here this morning? What's in our text? We got the Bible's first recorded war. This is the first time in Genesis that we come to the story of war. The kings of 4 city-states go to war against the kings of 5 city-states. Okay? So we're just going to kind of set the stage here a little bit that's going on. This is a historical account of a war that occurred. But really the focus of the text, as far as God is concerned, is not so much the details of the battle itself, as much as it is our place or Abram's place in it. You notice there was that one little phrase in verse 12, and Lot was taken with them. That's the focus of what this text is about, and Abram's courage in going in rescuing in him. So what we see here in this text, there are 5 kings of the south who were vassal kings. In other words, they were paying tribute to these 4 kings in the east, of which the leader was Kedorlaomer. He was the big shot, the big fish in this group of 4 city-states. And all of a sudden, the kings of the south decide, you know what? We don't think we should have to pay tribute to these guys anymore. This is our land, this is our stuff. And so the text says they rebelled. The problem for the kings in the east is that these other kings in the south lay right smack dab in the middle of the trade route between what we would call modern-day Iran and Egypt. And they needed to move their goods and services via this trade route, and if these kings in the south were not going to cooperate, something had to be done. And so the text says that they set out to restore law and order, for whatever you want to call that. They're going to put things back the way it is supposed to be. And so this rebellion here is threatening their livelihood. It's threatening their economic situation, much like all wars today. Sometimes I think maybe we've gone to war for valid reasons, but more often than not, wars occur over money and possessions or land. This battle recorded for us here is no different. In the 13th year that these people have been paying tribute to these other kings, they decide, you know what, we're done with this and we're going to rebel. The 4 kings of the east go to war to protect their interests here. And this seems, I think on the surface, to be a simple historical account for us. But why is God concerned that we know about this battle that happened some 4,500 years ago? It's not so much what's going on between the kings as much it is the people who are caught up in the mix. We see Abram and Lot. This is our second account of Abram and Lot. And if you remember the last time we were together in chapter 13, I told you there'd be 3 such occasions where the Bible records for us these interactions between Abram and Lot. And in each one of those instances, Abram is held up as a man of courage, faith, and obedience who walks and follows God. And Lot is always pictured as one who tends to follow his own way and the way of the world, and he is pictured here as a fool yet once again. One of the more interesting parts of the story is that even though Lot has gotten himself in this situation, neither God nor Abram gives up on him. Abram goes after Lot to rescue him and to bring him back into the fold. And so what seems to be a simple historical account of an ancient battle really revolves around this one verse. They also took Lot, the son of Abram's brother, who was dwelling in Sodom. That's the hinge point in our story this morning. Here we find the point, and we find why God has recorded it for us here. It's this continuing juxtaposition of Abram and his faithfulness over against Lot and his foolishness. And so what we're going to see from this text this morning revolves around this one key idea. Compromise with the world leads to consequences in life. Now, most of us who've lived very long have already learned that lesson, haven't we? Compromise with the world leads to consequences in life requiring something in response. What do you suppose that is? It is the courage of believers to combat the deceptions of sin and the temptations of the world by instead honoring God. So the first half of that statement is one that we all know intrinsically if we've lived very long. The second half of that statement is the one where we have to put faith into action. God calls upon us to do something in these instances, and that thing is to combat the deceptions of sin by choosing to honor God first in all that we do. And so though this battle is physical, it's representative of the spiritual battle that all of us are engaged in. Lot's suffering began with what? Spiritual compromise. That's how he got in this position, and we're going to talk about that in just a moment. Lot chose to go and move his tent over against Sodom. And that's what put him in this position in the first place. So his suffering began with spiritual compromise, just as ours does. Why do we suffer? Not exclusively, but generally. Why do we suffer? Generally because of spiritual compromise. When we make mistakes and we disobey the Lord, how can we expect not to be disciplined? And I think this is a perfect example of God's discipline of those whom he loves. We said at the outset of last week, or I guess it was 2 weeks ago, in chapter 13, the idea that Lot was saved. Lot knew the Lord. Lot was just very disobedient. And God was constantly having to go, come on, Lot, come back into the family here. Let me pull you back into the fold. And usually he had to do it with a stick or something of that nature, which is usually what it takes to motivate me, right? He was a very disobedient man, but he knew the Lord nonetheless. And so while it illustrates for us that his suffering began with spiritual compromise, as does ours, it also illustrates that God doesn't give up on us when we make mistakes. And we need to remember not to give up on people either. So I just want to look at this in the 4 parts of the statement that I gave you here just a moment ago. The first one is Lot's compromise with the world. Now, last time we saw the beginning of Lot's spiritual compromise, didn't we? If you go back to chapter 13 and verse 12, it's on your screen here this morning, we read this. Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled among the cities of the valley and moved his tent as far as Sodom. You begin to see that compromise even in the initial separation of Abram and Lot. Together, Abram and Lot came up out of Egypt. They returned from Egypt, and they were supposed to fall back in line with God. They were supposed to return to obedience. And what we saw in that text was Abram did. It said he returned and he went back to the plan and purpose of God. He came back to the land that God had showed him, and he got back on the plan, so to speak, with God. But what does Lot do? Lot chooses to go another direction. He chose to go it his own way. The men had returned from Egypt, and they had gathered many flocks and herds and servants and possessions and so forth and so on in chapter 13. And the Bible says that they had so much stuff they could no longer dwell together. And so Abram, sensing the rising conflict that is going to escalate between these two men, says, I got an idea. The land is not enough for us. Perhaps we should separate. If you go to the left, I will go to the right. Or if you go to the right, I will go to the left. But you choose. And we remember what Lot chose. Lot chose the cities of the valley. He chose the allure of the world. He chose the place where he saw the most opportunity to enrich himself personally, and he left Abram the desolate land of Canaan. And we saw even in that this kind of picture of our relationship with God. Our relationship with God is not strongest when we're in our successful place, when we're making the most money, when we feel like we're doing the best, earthly speaking. It's when we're in the desolate land and there's really nothing else to turn to except God himself. Abram remained in the desolate land where the Lord was. Lot went into the cities of the valley and pitched his tent over against Sodom, it says. What is Sodom representative of in the Bible? It's always a picture of sin. And so what he's trying to communicate, the writer of this book is trying to communicate to us, is that Lot chose to pitch his tent over against sin, to live near the world, to be a part of it, to be surrounded with it, all the while probably thinking, it won't affect me. I'm strong enough. I can withstand the world. I can withstand the influence of sin and the temptations that are there. Sound familiar? Right? The whole time he's thinking this and he's living it out, he's moving closer and closer and closer to Sodom and sin in each of these successive stories that we read with Lot. He's moving further from God and closer to sin. Lot had moved near Sodom in chapter 13, but what did I read to you a moment ago? Now where's he living? In Sodom. He moved closer, he saw it from a distance, he pitched his tent over against it, and now we find him living right in the middle of it. Right in the center of the picture of sin and depravity. It's a picture of continual spiritual decline in the life of Lot. First, we live near sin, right? We're in the world and it's all around us. But we try to stay unstained from it. But eventually we begin to give in a little and a little. We think it won't impact us. But ponder this for a minute. In Sodom, there was opportunity. There was a chance to make money and to grow wealthy. And that allure and that temptation seems to be greater than perhaps what Lot could overcome. It was far different than the desolate land in which Abram was wandering in Canaan. Yes, the people in Sodom were wicked. Lot would have known that from the outset, but did it stop him? No. Why? Because the opportunity was too great to pass up. And you begin to see that beginning of spiritual compromise. It's the temptation of the world. It's the allure of sin. It's this need and this desire that can become compelling to need to make money and to enrich ourselves. Lot is attracted to all of these things. And before we know it, what do we find? We choose to live in sin, fully ensnared by it. Lot's no different than any of the inhabitants of Sodom by this point. We're going to get to, in chapter 19, we'll get to the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, and we'll see that Lot is right smack dab in the middle of it. He's almost no different than the people who are dwelling there. And so instead of separation from the world that God has called us to, we end up in lockstep with the world. And that's the dangerous place for us to be. All the while proclaiming that the world has no impact on me. Not sensing the change that is occurring. Not realizing how I'm being changed by the world, and I'm not changing the world. What we should see is that sin is the cause of all the devastation in the world. That's what it's responsible for. And what we see in the world, we should avoid it like the plague that it is. There's a reason the New Testament refers to sin as a plague or as a disease or as an illness, one that is always going to lead to death, one that is always terminal. Once we've compromised spiritually, the practical life consequences can't be far behind. And that's exactly what we see in our text. And that's point number 2, Lot's consequences in his life. Notice in verse 1, I'm not going to read all these names again for you. You can read them. But in the days of these kings, they decide to go to battle, okay? War breaks out over economic issues. This is a regional conflict that eventually boils over into an international conflict. And verses 2 through 10 recount for us all of the details. The eastern kings march out against the southern kings, bringing destruction all along the way. Even countries who hadn't rebelled are now paying the penalty, the text says for us. Why? Because this is a scorched earth campaign. They leave the east, they're moving toward direction in the south, and everything that is in the way is going to be destroyed in order to bring this rebellion to an end. The kings of the south come out to meet them for battle, but notice it says they're quickly defeated and then plundered and then scattered. I also find it interesting that he makes the side note in there that says, in this land there were bitumen pits or tar pits. And who fell into them? The kings of the south, the people who lived there. I'm thinking, that's a pretty rotten war plan if you don't know your own land well enough to avoid the tar pits. But I think the writer is trying to illustrate for us the ignorance of these kings of the south. They're acting stupidly. They're acting foolishly. And the writer here is revealing that to us so we can see who these people are. Why is he doing that? Because he's setting up the destruction that's going to happen to these 5 cities in just a couple of chapters. Okay? And so the kings of the south, they come out, they try to put up a battle, they try to put up a fight, but it says they're quickly defeated, they're scattered, and all of their stuff is plundered. Notice verse 11 and 12 here of chapter 14. So the enemy took all the possessions of Sodom and Gomorrah, he took all their possessions and went their way. What does it mean? They defeated them, and they took all their stuff. This is the spoils of war. They didn't simply defeat them and say, now go back home and behave. They defeated them. They took all their stuff, including their people, their kinsmen and their countrymen, and were taking them back to their home country. How do you like that, is what they're basically trying to say here. They also, in verse 12, took Lot, son of Abram's brother, who was dwelling in Sodom, and they took his possessions and went their way. And so the casualties were that they lost their homes, their possessions, their families. Basically, they lost everything in this endeavor. Notice who was caught up in the melee. Lot, who's now living in Sodom, dwelling amongst these people. He's an example of what happens when we move outside the protection of God. When Abram set up that separation for them back in chapter 13, do you think Abram had in mind that he would go to Sodom and eventually move into Sodom and become like Sodom? No, Abram was calling him to remain under the protection of God. He was simply giving him first choice of the land. But Lot has seen the opportunity that exists in Sodom and has moved in and become one of them. This wasn't just a case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Ever happened to you? Happens to me all the time. Lot chose this. He's there because he chose to be there. This wasn't happenstance. This wasn't circumstance. It wasn't randomness. He chose to be there, and he's now reaping the consequences of this choice. He could have stayed with Abram in the center of God's will, but he chose the allure of the world. He went out from the people of God, where the protection was, and instead went out into the world, think, I can do it myself. I can go it alone. I'm strong enough to withstand this. Ever thought that? I can withstand it. I'm strong enough. The enemy won't defeat me. Yes, he will. You know why? He's stronger than you, and he's stronger than me. And so the place to remain is in the protection of the Lord and under the protection of God's people. I could probably write a whole other sermon going into drawing an analogy here that this is a picture of the church. When we are in the church, we're under the protection of God and we're amongst God's people where we are safe and we have accountability and we have protection. But out there in the world, going it alone, as the Lone Ranger Christian tries to do, we're in danger. At every turn, we're in danger of being picked off by the enemy. Why? We don't have any help. We're alone. We're by ourselves. And the enemy is good at twisting the truth and getting us to believe things and so forth and so on. That's exactly where Lot's at. He's left the protection of God and God's people, and he's journeyed into Sodom. He's become one of them. He either didn't recognize or at least didn't respect the dangers of his spiritual compromise. It's just a little sin. It's just a little compromise. It's just a little fudging of the numbers. It's just a little bending of the truth. It's just a little manipulation of the facts, right? That's where all spiritual compromise begins, isn't it? It's just a little softening, little shaving off of the rough edges, so to speak. And Lot didn't either recognize or respect the dangers of this compromise. In the midst of God's people, there's safety. There's safety in numbers. There's safety through encouragement. There's safety through example. There's safety through accountability. There's safety through access. All of those things are possible amongst the people of God. But once I leave that and go outside of that protection, I'm alone. I'm by myself. I don't have anyone to depend on. I don't have an example to follow. I don't have encouragement. I don't have accountability. And that's probably the most important one, right? Someone to hold us accountable to make sure we stay on that straight and narrow rather than deviating to the right or to the left. And so Lot has done all of these things. We're stronger and safer together. We're in danger by ourselves. But Lot chose to go it alone, and it cost him dearly. He's lucky that he lived. Only by the providence of God did he probably survive. And so spiritual compromise leads to spiritual separation. Moving outside of the protection of the people of God is dangerous for us. It leads to further separation, and I would argue further spiritual compromise. That's what we talk about when we mention the term backslidden Christian, don't we? What are we talking about there? For whatever reason, they have rejected the authority of God's word and the authority of God's people in the church, and they've decided to go it alone. And the problem is that's not a one-time decision. It's one decision that leads to many. And it becomes a slippery slope of one compromise and then another compromise and then another compromise until we don't even recognize them anymore. And it seems to be this is the slippery slope that Lot is on. By chapter 19, we're going to find him offering up his daughters to men who want to ravage them. That's a pretty big compromise, isn't it? But was it his first and only? No, it was the culmination of many little decisions, which is the same thing that can happen to us if we're not careful. Sin is a liar. It tells us that we do not need accountability. It tells us that we can go it alone. It says you'll be just fine. You don't need those people. They think they're better than you anyway. Don't listen to what they have to say. You do what you want to do. You have things the way you want to have them. That's what sin does. It's a liar. The consequences to that type of thinking and behavior are immeasurable for us. Once you start down that path, it is very hard to come back from it. And that's why I think the writer here has recorded these stories for us of Lot. It's so we can watch his degradation step by step by step and recognize it when those circumstances appear in our own life and we don't make the same mistakes. No one is perfect, but Lot here is far from even that. But fortunately, the story doesn't end there for us. We now deal with Abram's courage and faith, point number 3. Notice in verse 13, then one who had escaped came and told Abram the Hebrew. So somebody gets away. They hear about the battle, somebody gets out of town, and they know that Lot has been taken, and so they run off to tell Abram, hey, your nephew's been taken in this battle. These kings have come and plundered the city, and yada, yada, yada. That's where we're at. What does Abram say? It would have been tempting for Abram to say, I told him not to move to Sodom. I told him not to be foolish. I told him not to make those decisions. Let him live with it. It'd be very tempting to say that, wouldn't it? But that's not what he does. Notice here. One had escaped, came and told Abram the Hebrew, who was living by the oaks of Mamre the Amorite, brother of Eshcol and of Aner. These were allies of Abram. When Abram heard that his kinsman had been taken captive, he led forth his trained men, born in his house, 318 of them, and went in pursuit. Got to admire this guy. This is the original Braveheart here, right? 4 kings and kingdoms have sacked these cities, plundered all their goods, taken all their people away, and what's Abram go? Get my boys, let's go. And takes out after them. Notice this, pursues them all the way to Dan. Now, that doesn't mean much to us, but if you know your geography of the ancient Near East, that's a long ways away. It's nearly 100 miles on foot with 300 people in the desert. So this is a monumental undertaking that Abram embarks upon. He hears what's happened a lot, and I want you to notice here 3 things about his courage. First, I want you to notice his attitude. It would have been easy for him to say, sorry for Lot, shouldn't have done it. Now you're reaping the consequences. And went on with his life, right? That'd be very tempting. Be tempting to me sometimes. But that's not what he does. Abram chooses to go after Lot. He's a wayward child, but nonetheless, he's a child of God. Remember, I told you a minute ago, Lot's saved. He knows the Lord. Not in the New Testament theological sense, but he knows the Lord. He has faith, and therefore it's accounted to him as righteousness. And so while he may be wayward, he may be crooked, he may be bent, he nonetheless belongs to God. And Abram recognizes that fact and is not going to leave him up to the devices of these wicked kings of the east. He goes after him. It's illustrative of the fact or the point that the New Testament tells us that Jesus left the 99 sheep to go after the one. Now, in our thinking, we might think, well, 99, I need to protect the 99. Sorry for the one's luck. It shouldn't have wandered off. But that's not how God thinks. That's not how Jesus thinks. It's not how Abram thought, and not how we should think either. He is a child of God, and Abram goes after him. He assembles all of his household to engage the enemy. Notice the courage here of Abram. He gears up for battle. I found this to be an interesting point. He's got 318 men that live in his house that work for him. This is not a unwealthy man. I don't know many of us that have 318 people working for us, let alone in our household. Abram has become a very wealthy and blessed man by this point. But notice here his allies. His allies are his friends, Mamre, Eshcol, and Aner. Those names are recorded there because these people have taken up with Abram. He's probably wandering in their lands. The indication here is they're probably rulers or potentates or kings of these various areas that he talks about. What were they? Mamre, that's a proper name, but it's also a place. He was an Amorite, which is a particular kingdom. Brother of Eshcol and Aner, those are both kingdoms as well. These were probably kings. So Abram had friends in high places. So he assembles his allies. He assembles his men that are born in his household, 318 of them, armed and trained men loyal to Abram. Notice the text tells us they went out for battle. These probably weren't farmers or plowmen or shepherds, or if they were, they'd been trained for war. And Abram assembles them to take them out into battle and to recover what is not only his, but what is the Lord's. Notice here his achievement. And he divided his forces against them by night. So what's he do? He lays an ambush here. He and his servants, and he defeated them and pursued them to Hobah, north of Damascus. So if Dan is in the south, 100 miles away from where Abram is basically living and dwelling, Damascus now is on the other end of the spectrum. So he's chased them basically in a big old circle, and he's chasing them back to the east where they come from. You got to love that. Not only did he chase them out of town, he chases them out of the country. And so he gets all the way to Damascus. Then he brought back all the possessions and also brought back his kinsman Lot with his possessions and the women and the people. In other words, he defeats them soundly, takes all the stuff back. That's the achievement here. Abram and 318 men takes on 4 kings of the east. Do you think somebody was on his side? I think so. Abram and his men ambush the kings. They defeat them, chase them all the way to Damascus. And what 4 kings and 4 kingdoms could not accomplish, Abram and his men do. Notice they came and attacked 5 kingdoms of the south, and they basically laid down. But Abram comes along with his 318 men and destroys them. Wonder why? We're going to see that in a moment. Abram retrieved all that the kings had taken, and they suffered a bitter defeat and were broken. He destroyed these kingdoms, essentially. And so to rescue a sinning brother, which is what Abram is doing here, Lot has wandered off into sin, moved into Sodom. He's become a sinner. He's a sinning brother. He's departed from the people of God, from the protection of God. Abram goes after him. That's the spiritual picture here. To rescue a sinning brother, it takes the courage of believers to do whatever is necessary in order to bring them back in the fold. This means when we encounter a sinning brother, we have a responsibility to go after them and at least attempt to bring them back. Now, some refuse to come, right? That's not the focus of this text. Some refuse to come and want to remain there. We can't do anything about that. But we should at least make the initial effort to go and attempt to restore them. We may not have to go out in physical battle as Abram did, right? I'm hoping I don't need to go to Iran today to rescue one of you, but if you end up there, I'll make my best effort. But we do go out in spiritual battle, right? And that spiritual battle is no less dangerous for us. Because now you're not engaging in a battle of flesh and bone, but you're engaging in a spiritual battle, one in which our enemy is far more powerful than we. And so these spiritual battles are dangerous, and they are not without cost, but it does not negate our responsibility to engage in them anyway. And so that's kind of the historical account of what's going on there. I want to look now, finally, at the application of this. It's point number 4. We must combat the deceptions of sin and temptations of the world by honoring God. That's what we do in these situations. Upon Abram's victory, 2 kings now make their entrance. You can imagine one's coming for what? He wants his stuff back. That's pretty easy to understand. But the more important encounter is with this other king that appears on the scene. Notice here in verse 17, after his return from the defeat of Kedorlaomer and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet him at the valley of Shaveh, that is the king's valley. You can imagine it went something like this. Oh, great Abraham, thank you for rescuing all of our people and all of our stuff. We're here to collect. I have to imagine that's probably how this encounter went with Abram. But another king that we should equally expect makes his appearance on the scene, the king of Salem. Melchizedek, the Bible tells us his name is, and it says that he is the priest of the Most High God. And so just as Abram and Lot were in juxtaposition throughout our story, now we get this juxtaposition of these 2 kings, the king of Sodom and the king of Salem here. Abram is confronted with yet another decision to make. Is he going to obey God, or is he going to follow the ways of the world? That's the question, and that's the question that I'm convinced that you and I have to deal with nearly every day in our life. We make hundreds, if not thousands, of decisions every day, and a lot of those decisions revolve around this question. Am I going to obey God and do what he said, or am I going to do what is expedient, what is easier, what is profitable, what is more appealing, what is more alluring, or what have you? Again, Abram is confronted. Now, why is this recorded? It's recorded because you remember what happened last time Abram was confronted with this decision? Remember, there was a famine in the land, and what did Abram do? Instead of staying where he was told to stay, instead of staying put, he decided, let's go to Egypt. There's food there. And you remember what happened in Egypt, right? It didn't go well for him down there, but God restored him anyway, and now he has a second opportunity. It's as if God's going, okay, you screwed up last time. Let's see if you do better this time. And so these 2 kings make their appearance on the scene. Abram here is fresh from victory, and we would think less susceptible to temptation, right? He's just won a monumental battle, and God has given him the victory. You think he'd be on cloud 9. Undefeatable, right? Not susceptible to temptation. But we know better, don't we? Our spiritual mountaintops are often just as dangerous as our spiritual valleys, aren't they? Sometimes they can be more dangerous because our guard is down and we're not looking. And that's where Abram's at in this story. So, as we so often find in our lives, temptation comes at points of defeat and also at points of victory. When we think we're the strongest is often when the enemy attacks. The spiritual mountaintop is equally as dangerous as the spiritual valley, despite the fact that we don't often see that ahead of time. That's one that we often learn in hindsight, unfortunately. But learning this and studying this, hopefully we'll see it in advance of the next one that comes along. So let's look at the contrast between these 2 kings here. First, we're going to look at the priest of God in verse 18. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High. And he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. Okay. Melchizedek, literally translated, means king of righteousness. That's what that term means. Salem, from which he is the priest and also the king, is the precursor to Jerusalem, which means what? City of peace. So he is the king of righteousness from the city of peace who comes out to greet Abram. You already see where I'm going with this, don't you? Melchizedek is this king of righteousness from the city of peace, and he greets Abram with a blessing. He brings blessing to Abraham directly from the Lord. Notice here he brings out bread and wine. I don't want to read too much into that, but you almost see some allusions there to what we're going to observe in just a moment. The Lord's Supper and the sacrifice of Christ and so forth and so on. He brings it out, and perhaps this is an allusion to Jesus' victory at the cross. It might be stretching it a bit for me to be dogmatic about that, but I think there's a picture here at least. And Melchizedek gives thanks to God for victory, and he gives thanks for Abram and his faithfulness. It's as if Melchizedek is calling Abram to account. You've just won a great victory, but remember from whom it came. In other words, you didn't do this on your own. He invokes the name of the God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and so forth and so on. He's reminding him, I don't want to communicate that this was at all adversarial. This was a celebration, but a good priest is always faithful to remind his people to turn to the Lord, right? And that's what he does here. Melchizedek's presence functions as a reminder to Abram to remain faithful. I find it interesting. He comes back from battle. There's been no other mention of Melchizedek in the Old Testament at all. This is his first appearance on the scene. And right at the moment of victory, who shows up? God's representative. Gotta love that, right? It's as if God is sending him right out and going to say, don't forget, don't get too big for your britches. See what happened to Lot? That could happen to you. So Melchizedek shows up, and it functions as an encouragement to remain faithful to God. God provided, God did this. Don't deviate from the path, and certainly don't deviate now in the presence of this victory. And so notice Abram's response. I find this interesting. And Abram gave him a tenth of everything. What is that demonstrating? Abram's faithfulness, right? It's showing that he trusted not necessarily this man, Melchizedek, but that he trusted in God. Melchizedek shows up, tells him where the victory came from. Abram's response is to give sacrificially of all of these spoils that he has taken in battle, recognizing in that God's provision and God's protection. Now, when we think about the term tenth, we think about the term tithe. Tithe literally means tenth. We talk about that a lot in church circles, don't we? But the tithe represents Abram's recognition of what God did. That's not any different from what we do today. When we give today, we are recognizing God's provision in our lives, aren't we? That's what allows us to sacrifice of what we have, knowing that not only did God provide all of what we have, but God will continue to provide all that we're ever going to have. And so we see this picture of that here. The text illustrates for us the importance of sacrificial giving, and it begins with this giving of a tithe. We give not because we have to, but we give because we want to. Notice this is a voluntary giving of Abram. It's not compelled. This is not a temple tax. Melchizedek didn't show up with a stick saying, give me my portion. This is something Abram willingly gives. And it's a perfect presentation of how we should give as well. We give sacrificially, but we do so cheerfully and willfully. We never should do that in compulsion or feel compelled to give something that the Lord has not laid upon our heart. Abram here gives willingly. But alas, even in victory, temptation is close. Abram has experienced this great victory, and temptation is close, and it makes its appearance in the prince of the world in verse 21. And the king of Sodom said to Abram, give me the persons, but take the good for yourself. And so these two kings show up. Rightly, Abram meets with Melchizedek first. Then he meets with the king of Sodom. The prince of the world comes first with a demand. Notice Melchizedek didn't ask for anything, only reminded him what God had done. But the king comes with a demand. The world is always demanding something of us, isn't it? They rarely come as a request, or even if they are, we know that there's a stick that stands behind it. The world is always demanding something of us. The enemy is never satisfied, and he always wants more. You can imagine that in this instance, even if Abram had given in and said, okay, here you go, take that, you think they would have been happy? No, they just would have come back asking for more. It's kind of like the IRS. You give and give and give, and they just keep coming back asking for more and more and more. They'll never be satisfied. Well, the world is never satisfied. The king of Sodom is never going to be satisfied. But notice here the early allusion to the Sodomite carnality that's in view here. I honestly miss this the many times I have read this passage before. But notice what the king asks for. Give us the people. He doesn't ask for the possessions, the money, the flocks, the herds. And give us the people. Now, we might tend to think that that's an honorable thing, right? We don't care about money. We just want our family back. And possibly there was some component to that. But think about Genesis 19. When the angels arrive at the house of Lot in the city of Sodom, and they're inside, what happens? The men of Sodom come to the house, and they began to beat on the door and make what demand? Give us the people. Give us the men inside. I think there's an allusion here to the carnality of these Sodomites here. The Sodomites' king's offer is one of temptation to Abraham. Take the money and we can be friends. Just let us have the people. But Abram's not going to take the bait. He knows that compromising with the world is going to put him in a position that he's going to have a hard time negotiating his way back out of. And so instead he rejects the offer. Abram is not deceived here. Notice thirdly, the patron of God in verse 22. But Abram said to the king of Sodom, I have lifted my hand to the Lord God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and I told him that I would not take a thread or a sandal strap or anything that belongs to you. I'm not touching any of your stuff. Why? Lest you should say, I have made Abram rich. I know you'll have a hold on me. You'll have something to put over my head. You'll have a claim on me. I'm not giving you an inch. You're not going to have an opportunity to speak into my life, to control my life, or to take credit for anything that my God Most High has done. I have sworn an oath to God to not do these things, and I will not go back on it now. Verse 24, I will take nothing but what the young men have eaten. Basically, these guys went to battle. They ate along the way. So we're going to take that, and the share of the men who went with me, let Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre take their share. In other words, my allies who fought with me, you can go negotiate with them. But I'm taking nothing. I want nothing to do with any of your stuff, lest you might have a claim on me for something that God did. Abram swore an oath, and he wasn't going to go back on it here in any sense of the word. He looked ahead to how he was going to be looked upon, which is wise advice for all of us. He was very concerned that if he took something from the Sodomite king, that somehow in the future somebody might say, I don't know about that Abram. He's kind of in cahoots with the Sodomites over there. He didn't want any challenge on his character. He didn't want any kind of challenge to his integrity. He wanted nothing to do with it. And I can remember that being a lesson that I had to learn in business many, many years ago. I was warned about who you go into business with because what they do, you've now done. And you want to be careful who you're in cahoots with or who you're in business with or the relationships that you have with people, because people tend to not separate the two and they see you as one. And I had to learn that lesson early in business, to be careful who you're associated with, because some of these guys have some very bad reputations. And there were some opportunities that I had to turn down and walk away from because I didn't want to be associated with those people. And that's what Lot should have done, shouldn't it? The opportunity was there. Let's go to Sodom. We'll make money. He should have walked away, but he didn't, and it cost him dearly. Abram refuses to make the same compromise and fall into the same mistake. Owe no one anything. It is for your character. Don't owe anyone anything. Abram's only concern here is God and his honor and his glory. He refuses to let the king of Sodom have any influence in his life or take any credit for the things that he has done. Abram is not interested in worldly possessions, even though he is a very wealthy man because of the sovereign hand of God. He's not interested in accumulating more, even though he should have rightly been entitled to it, right? He went to battle. He fought these kings. He took the spoils. He could have legitimately and legally taken these things. But his character and integrity mattered more to him than his worldly possessions, and he rejected it. The lesson for us in that are the words of Jesus, who said, "Seek ye first the kingdom of God. And all these other things that you worry about, money, shelter, clothing, those will be added unto you as well." Seek first the kingdom of God. Don't worry about all these other things. God is going to provide. Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness in all that you do. Abram put that some 2,000 years ahead of time into practice right here in this story. He sought first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and he let God deal with the rest. And even in that, God provided to Abram richly. And so we have to combat the deceptions of sin and the temptations of the world, because they're everywhere and they're alluring and they're tempting to us. How do we do that? By honoring God in all that we do first. That's the question we ask. How does this situation, how does this scenario, how does this circumstance, how can I honor God in this situation rather than honoring self? How can I honor God in all that I do rather than compromising with the world? Those are the questions that we have to ask. They seem to be the questions that Abram asked, even though it's not, his thought process is not recorded here for us. We can only see the outcome. But it seems to be that he has weighed these questions and has answered rightly. Will we make the same right decisions? Compromise with the world leads to consequences in life every single time. And when those compromises are made, it requires the courage of believers to combat the deceptions and the temptations of the world by honoring God first in all that we do. That is the necessity of the Christian life. Which path will you choose today? Will you be like Lot, who was drawn in by the temptations of the world and the opportunities that exist in it? Or will you remain faithful like Abram, who rejected living near sin and in sin and instead chose to follow the ways of God? That's the question that is before you this morning. Are you that person of courage? Are you willing to follow after God even when it costs you something? Are you courageous enough to go after the lost sinner and restore him to the fellowship of faith, even though it may be difficult? Are you willing to say no to the temptations and the allures of the world in order to follow what God said and to believe it to be true? That is the question I leave you with this morning. Let us pray.